Lunch rush always brought a kind of noise that felt alive. Forks clinking, servers rushing between tables, ice cracking in glasses, all of it wrapped in the thick Georgia heat that leaked in from the back alley despite the building's old charm. Mason's table in downtown Savannah looked polished from the outside, with its painted shutters and brick steps, but inside the pressure simmered. Cooks shouted back and forth. The air was solid with steam and grease, and every movement had to be fast. Lena Brooks, 28 years old and running on hardly any sleep, had just finished her fourth back-to-back shift in 3 days. She kept her head low, wiped her hands on her apron, and slipped toward the dumpsters out back. Her legs were heavy, but she didn't stop until she reached the metal bin. She hesitated for a second, making sure nobody was around, then lifted the lid. Carefully, as if handling glass, she pulled out a clamshell container from near the top. Inside was a grilled chicken salad, plastic fork still tucked beneath the lid, barely touched. She looked at it for a long second, then sat on an old crate against the wall. Her fingers shook as she opened the lid. The dressing was already poured, smelled a little like lemon. First bite in, she started crying. Quietly, like someone who didn't want the tears to be noticed even by herself. The food was cold, but it tasted like relief. Unaware, in the far corner of the dining room by the windows, a quiet man had noticed her slipping away. Henry Dalton, the CEO of the Masons table chain, had shown up days earlier under a different name. Simple clothes, worn sneakers, no one suspected a thing. He'd spent his time sitting in corners, tasting the food, watching the staff, taking notes not just on service times or customer feedback, but on people. When he saw Lena eating from the trash, he didn't move. He didn't flinch. He just watched her. And in that moment he didn't feel pity. What he saw wasn't weakness. It was someone swallowing her pride because there was no time for anything else. That right there planted something in him. He didn't decide to overhaul operations or fire anyone. Not yet. But something shifted. He knew he couldn't unsee it. And from that moment on, the real changes began. Quietly, slowly, and with no memo sent. The next morning, things started, just like any other at the Savannah unit. Prep work began early. The older burners on the back stoves clicked stubbornly before catching, and the drawers never closed quite right. But there was one difference. Someone new walked in wearing the standard black uniform, borrowed cap bent, at the rim, and a name tag that read Harry. He looked a little older than most of the kitchen staff, maybe in his late 50s, heavy around the shoulders, quiet to the point of invisible. Marla, the manager, barely gave him a second glance. When she muttered, "He's the new kitchen aide, keep him out of the way." And that was it. No introduction, no tour, just a stack of onions and the hope he wouldn't slow anyone down. Most folks on staff just shrugged and went back to their own chaos. A new guy meant questions, and no one had time for extra trouble. But Lena, already elbow deep in prep and barely keeping up with her list, spotted Harry struggle with the industrial peeler. She walked over quietly and offered to switch stations with him for a while. When he hesitated, she gave a small nod like it was nothing. That was how it started, her showing him which shelf held the dry towels, where the olive oil was kept. When the label peeled off, how to twist the mixer's base when it jammed. Not once did she treat him like a burden. Harry, really Henry, stayed quiet. He worked with slow care, not just with his hands, but with his eyes. He noticed how Marla watched from the office window like a hawk, barking orders through a walkie-talkie. Even when standing a few feet away, he noticed how expired dates were wiped off sauces with wet paper towels, and how staff morale stayed low, even when the food looked great going out. Marla ran the place like a business plan stapled to a cutting. Bored, aggressive with numbers, blind to people. Henry saw her repackage full trays of untouched bread from the previous week, always blaming waste on staff mistakes. But through all of this, what kept drawing his attention was Lena, her quiet grace, her willingness to fill every gap, her skipping lunch most days without anyone noticing but him, and he kept watching because the smallest details always told the biggest truths. It was just after lunch rush, that strange quiet gap when the last late diners finish their meals and the kitchen finally exhales. Henry had slipped into the walk-in cooler to restock some vegetables, but he wasn't in a hurry. The cold air gave him a break from the heat and noise, and he used these pockets of silence to watch without being watched. That's how he found himself behind rows of lettuce heads when he heard Marla's voice slice through the stillness. She stood near the doorway with a supplier, a guy in a grey cap who looked like he'd done this dance with her before. Henry couldn't hear every word at first, but then Marla's tone got louder. "Those expiration labels, swap them before you load," she said, rummaging through a clipboard stacked with fresh invoices. "It's not waste, it's smart math." She gave a little laugh, the kind people do when they think they're being clever, though there was nothing funny about it. Henry stayed quiet in the shadows, heart slowed in that strange way it does when something you suspected turns out to be real. He already believed there were dark corners in the Mason's table chain, places where numbers looked too good to be honest, and this moment in one of his own restaurants confirmed a much deeper rot. But instead of confronting Marla then, he stepped out casually later as if he'd seen nothing. No confrontation, no warning. He'd learned that catching the problem was the easy part. Understanding how far down it went was the real work. Later that afternoon, while mopping near the front, Henry caught something without meaning to. Lena was clearing a table while chatting with a co-worker, and her hands moved almost without thinking. She slid the leftover chicken bones quickly into a small compost bin, then eased the untouched bread to the side, carefully placed the water glass upright again, and folded the napkin neatly over the plate. It was so smooth, it looked like habit. Henry recognized the gesture. She wasn't just tidying, she was saving what she could. Maybe not for tonight, maybe not consciously, but her body had learned how to save food like someone who knew what hunger was. And in that moment, the numbers he usually cared about, cost, waste, labor, slipped into the background. This was no longer about margins, it was about people, and something inside him started to shift. By the middle of the week, the heat in the kitchen at Mason's table was practically humming off the walls. Pans sizzled non-stop, timers rang like alarms in a hospital, and the smell of roasted garlic hung in the air like a memory too stubborn to leave. Lena moved between stations with her usual quiet focus until she reached for one of the sauce pots. Near the end of the prep line, Dorian was working beside her, sleeves rolled up, wiping sweat off his brow with the back of his hand. "Hey," Lena said, dipping a spoon in the thick sauce. "This one feels a little sweet, don't you think?" Dorian gave a sideways glance, not ready to admit it. He had been making that burnt apple glaze the same way for the past 10 years. But something about Lena made it hard to brush off. She wasn't pushy, she just had that tone, sure but not loud. He shrugged. "Try cutting the sugar in half." "Just once," she added. He gave in, half out of curiosity, half out of instinct. The result hit different, brighter, cleaner, less sticky on the tongue and more balanced. Even he had to nod. "I'll be damned," he said, and for the first time, he seriously looked at her, not just as a helper, but as someone with a real feel for food. Over the next week, he started asking her more. Not in a formal way, but like passing notes during class. Small tweaks, questions, tasting things together. One night after closing, when most of the staff had gone home, Dorian asked if she wanted to help him test a pie recipe he hadn't touched. In years, it was his grandmother's idea of dessert, rough around the edges but full of flavor. Lena stayed. The air was still heavy with the smell of pepper and yeast when they slid the dish into the oven. While they cleaned up, they talked, not about work, but about family. Lena shared, almost by accident, that her grandmother cooked professionally a long time ago. Dorian smiled and walked to the back office. He came out with a battered notebook, his working draft for a future cookbook. Inside was an old photo tucked between the pages. He placed it on the counter and Lena stared. It was her grandmother, maybe 30 years younger, laughing, flour on her apron, beside the original founder of Mason's table. Her hands trembled just slightly. In that quiet moment it became clear. This place was in her blood, whether she'd known it or not. It happened just before closing, during that messy window when silverware clatters into tubs and tired conversations between co-workers fill the kitchen. Marla, storming in from the wine storage room, held up an empty box like it was a piece of evidence in a courtroom. Her eyes landed on B, a quiet server in her early 30s who mostly kept to herself and never raised her voice. 2 bottles are missing, Marla snapped, eyes narrowing, and you're the only one who stepped inside today. B froze, hands gripping the edge of the prep sink. I didn't take anything, she said, voice low but steady. Her uniform was damp from cleaning side work, her hair in its usual neat braid. But Marla wasn't listening. She waved the manager on duty over and began filling out notes as if this was already decided. Lena was wiping tables at the far end when she heard the tone shift. She walked over slowly, towel still in her hand, and stood between them. That's not true, Lena said, looking straight at Marla. B was with me when you say the wine went missing. We were prepping station supplies together. You can check the stock sheet I signed. A hush fell over the room. The regional manager, who had been doing a routine check of the numbers in the office, had stepped out just in time to catch the exchange. His gaze bounced between Marla and Lena, waiting. Marla clenched her jaw. Not your place to speak, she said sharply. Stay in your lane, Lena. But it was too late. The doubt had already crept in. People saw it. How B's eyes welled up, how Lena stood firm. In that moment, something invisible passed between the staff, a kind of promise laid in silence. Henry was there too, sorting storage labels in the back, close enough to witness the whole thing. He hadn't interfered. He didn't have to. What stuck with him wasn't the drama. It was what Lena risked. She barely had enough to take care of herself, and still she stepped up to protect someone else. That wasn't just integrity. It was leadership, the kind that couldn't be taught. He realized then this place didn't need to return to anything. It needed rebirth. And maybe Lena, without knowing it, was already leading the way. The kitchen had reached that predictable chaos around dinner rush, orders flying in, tickets stuck in crooked lines above the grill, voices overlapping with clanks of pans. Henry, still in his Harry disguise, was moving quickly between the prep tables to grab a container of garlic puree when his foot slid straight through a puddle of spilled bechamel. There was no time to brace. He landed hard on his side, barely catching himself with his left arm, but his right shoulder took the hit. Everything stopped for a second. Someone dropped a ladle. Dorian muttered something under his breath and stepped forward, but Lena was already at Henry's side, squatting next to him before most people even registered what had happened. "Don't move yet," she said calmly, eyes scanning his arm. Her hands were firm and practiced. She called over her shoulder for a towel, then darted to the herb rack and came back with a handful of fresh mint and parsley, wrapping them tight, in cloth with ice from the drink station. "Herbs help more than they should," she said, pressing the bundle gently against Henry's swollen shoulder. "At least they smell like something real." Dorian stood a few feet away, arms crossed, watching not just what she did, but how she did it. And that moment, no uniform, no manager voice, no formal orders, was different. It was just care. Henry, wincing through the pain, let out a breath that turned into something close to an actual laugh. "Well," he mumbled, That landing could have been better timed. Later, in the back room that doubled as a staff rest area, Henry sat quietly while Lena sat across from him with a glass of water. The ice compress rested on his shoulder, wrapped now in a clean towel. The noise of the kitchen was muffled by thick walls and the hum of an old fan. Lena spoke without looking directly at him. "When I was a kid, I fell at a farmer's market, split my knee wide open. I screamed louder than the sirens. An apple vendor came over, ripped up her apron and patched me up. She told me something I haven't forgotten. You look after what's grounding you first. Nobody flies without steady feet." Henry didn't say much, but he gently tore a piece of paper from the notepad in his pocket and scribbled those words down. He didn't know yet, but months later, those same words would open his keynote speech, the one that changed how the company moved forward. It started with scraps, folded napkins from the back of the storage room, corner pieces of inventory reports no one looked at twice, and those plain brown paper bags from produce deliveries. Lena didn't use notebooks, maybe because they felt too official, too serious. But late at night, or during her meal breaks, she'd sit in the break room or lean over a prep table and scribble something down quickly before someone noticed. Notes like rosemary pears better with lemon zest than garlic, or swap out cream in pudding for coconut milk, lighter and warmer. At first, she didn't let anyone know. The scraps ended up tucked behind trays in Dorian's old cookbook, drafts or slid between seasoning jars that only she remembered to clean. It wasn't fear exactly, but vulnerability, an odd feeling for someone used to being invisible most of the time. Still, the ideas kept coming. One night, when most staff had cleared out and only Dorian B. and two others remained, Lena nervously pulled one out. "I've been thinking, maybe we try this." It was a simple cornbread cake, made with cornmeal, a touch of whole wheat flour, lavender buds soaked in milk, and honey instead of sugar. Dorian glanced over the scrawled recipe, raised an eyebrow, then smiled. "Let's bake." They worked quietly with the overhead lights dimmed low, like it would matter if someone peeked through the office window. When the smell hit the air, sweet and earthy, everyone stopped what they were doing. That cake, fresh from the oven, was passed around in silence. The first bite made B blink back tears. Dorian only nodded. "Keep going," he had told Lena, putting a steady hand on her shoulder. "Don't let this stay hidden." A few days later, Henry found a folded square tucked under a box of parchment sheets. Some note left behind. He opened it. The ink had bled slightly into the brown paper, but the words were clear enough: chili-crusted okra fries with garlic aioli. He tried it himself on a Sunday morning before the shift started. The flavor wasn't just surprising, it was something new, something the company didn't have. Intrigued, he kept searching, pocketing new ideas when he found them. Eventually, he shared one with the regional manager during a casual catch-up, calling it "submitted by the Savannah team." Marla never even glanced at the tray, but someone up the ladder did. Slowly, Lena's food, her voice, began slipping through the cracks, breaking the surface like roots do under sidewalks. It was a regular Thursday afternoon at Mason's, table in downtown Savannah, the kind of day where lunch moved fast but not frantic, and the staff slipped into a rhythm without too much hassle. No one noticed the woman at table 7 at first. Just another traveler, maybe a local on a lunch break. She wore a sweatshirt and sunglasses pushed up into her hair, tapping notes into her phone while waiting for her order. She didn't ask for anything fancy, just the day's special, the revitalized home-style stew, a dish built by Lena from scratch, with sweet potatoes, roasted okra, and smoked paprika in a slow-simmered broth. It tasted like something pulled from a grandmother's Sunday kitchen, but cleaner, lighter somehow. When the woman tasted it, she paused, looked down, and took a slow second bite, then a third. She pulled out her phone and started recording right there. 2 hours later, The video was live. 10 minutes of heartfelt talk about real food, meals that made you feel human again, and how this little restaurant in Savannah offered something bigger than good service, something warming from the inside out. By Saturday, Mason's table had a line out the door. Marla, noticing the crowd and putting two and two together, moved quickly. During the Sunday shift, she gathered the staff and made a short announcement. She said corporate had noticed her new direction with menu inspiration and complimented her intuition when refreshing the kitchen's old listings. The recognition, of course, fell squarely on her shoulders, at least in her version of the story. But Henry had been paying attention for weeks now. He'd seen too many scratched-up napkin notes tucked into tasks Marla never touched, too many ideas passed off as hers, and too many names left out of credit. His notebook, quiet and steady like him, now held entries with dates, menu names, and which hands had actually cooked them. What Marla didn't know was that his patience was reaching its limit. He watched her congratulate herself in front of the staff, while Lena stood in the back polishing silverware, not making a sound. The truth was no longer hiding. It was boiling, right in front of him, gradually, like a stew left on the flame too long. One more lie, one more stolen idea, and Henry would be ready to tip the pot himself. It was late afternoon, just after the lunch rush, when Lena ducked into the old pantry closet near the back of the kitchen. Most of the staff avoided it. It smelled like cardboard and bleach, and the light flickered when you tapped the switch too hard. She was looking for more mason jars, the kind they use now to stack the pickled red onions she'd started a few weeks ago. Instead, tucked far in the corner behind a stack of unopened plates, she saw a battered box marked Old Materials, Staff Use. Curiosity nudged her. She pulled the box out and opened it. Inside, buried under outdated training pamphlets and faded inventory charts, sat a thick recipe book covered in dust. Her fingers brushed over the cover like it might fall apart. Most of the pages were printed, kitchen standard, but scattered between them were slips of paper, scribbled in handwriting not unlike her grandmother's. Flip by flip, she traced the notes: extra nutmeg in the peach cobbler, a different frying time for green tomatoes, tips on saving onion skins for broth. Then, stuffed between two listings for holiday specials, there it was. The same photograph Dorian had once shown her, but this one was sharper, less worn, the edges clean. Her grandmother smiling wide, one hand wrapped around a mixing bowl, the other resting on the shoulder of Mason's table's founder, out in the back garden. The same creaky patio still stood there now, just past the employee smoking bench. That image did something to her. She sat on the pantry floor for a full minute, staring. This wasn't some abstract coincidence. Her family had helped build this place, even if no one wanted to remember it. Her grandmother cooked in this very kitchen, laughed in this garden, probably scrubbed the same floors Lena walked across every shift, and somehow her picture had ended up buried in a pile marked "Forgotten." Lena folded the photo gently and tucked it into her apron pocket. The knot in her chest loosened slowly. Maybe she wasn't just borrowing space here. Maybe she belonged. Diploma or not, title or not, that dish she made last week tasted like her grandmother's hands had helped stir it. For the first time in years, she felt something she didn't dare name yet. But like a bread rising in low heat, it had started quietly inside her. It happened not long after closing on a rainy Tuesday. Most of the staff had gone home, save for a few finishing cleanup. Henry called Marla into the small office, caged in the back of the kitchen, where the Wi-Fi barely worked, and the chair squeaked every time someone leaned forward. She walked in with her usual forced smile, probably expecting some harmless check-in. But Henry didn't bother with pleasantries. The desk, he laid down printed emails, financial statements, and flagged supplier reports. Side by side, they told a quiet but undeniable story. Duplicate invoices that didn't match shipments, supplier codes that trace back to nowhere, and time-stamped records showing Marla inputting cost updates just minutes before payment approvals. Right next to that stack, he placed napkin sketches and recipe cards that never had her handwriting, but appeared as her submissions in company update memos. "I've seen enough," Henry said, calm but steady. "I wanted to believe you were trying to keep this place afloat, but this is something else." Marla tried her usual tactic, turning the tone personal, talking about loyalty, the stress of margins, how she was doing what no one else would to keep the lights on. But Henry didn't flinch. He just asked her to stop talking. Then, without another word, he picked up his coat, nodded to Dorian in the kitchen doorway and walked out. And then, for a full week, Henry was gone. No texts, no calls, no one at corporate picking up on what was happening. In that space, the restaurant paused, and then slowly shifted. With Marla somewhere between distracted and paranoid, Lena started taking more initiative in the day-to-day, quietly at first. She reorganized the cleaning schedules, balancing them fairly, so the same people didn't always get stuck with the closing grime. She suggested swapping short breaks in rotation on busy days. She helped B train the 2 new hires without being asked. On Saturday, without any announcements, Lena made lunch for the whole team using leftover squash, tomatoes, and a sauce she'd been working on for weeks. She didn't mention that the base came from her grandmother's old recipe. She just placed the plates gently on the counter and watched. One by one, people sat with forks in hand, chewing slowly, nodding, smiling without saying much. No music, no orders, just taste and memory. That little dining room started to feel like something again. No title, no headline, just people starting to come home to themselves.